She didn't scream when the soles of her feet came apart. There was no one to hear it anyway. She just bit down hard on her lip, tasting rust and dust, and pulled the filthy hem of her skirt down a little lower. The motion was automatic now. Hide the damage, hide the shame, hide the blood. The little boy on her hip didn't weigh much. He was mostly bones and fear, but after 3 days of walking, he felt like an anchor dragging her down into the scorched earth. He was barely 4 years old. He stirred once, a single feather-light whisper against her collarbone. "Mama." Then he was gone again, lost in the feverish sleep of a child who had seen too much. Behind them, the town of Redemption was a memory of smoke and hate. It had taken less than a day for them to destroy her life. First, they burned her cabin. Then, they burned her name. They'd spat the word witch at her, their voices thick with righteous fury. Her crime? Sheltering 2 Lakota children whose parents had vanished into the prairie. They said she was consorting with savages, bringing a curse upon them. So when the preacher's wife was taken by cholera, it wasn't God's will. It was Sorella's fault. It was the witch's work. They'd locked her out of the schoolhouse when she begged for a crust of bread for the boys. They'd thrown stones at her windows at night. And then, they'd come with torches. So she walked. She'd grabbed the one child she could find in the smoke, Levi, and she ran. No wagon, no food, no map. Just the blistering heat of the prairie baking the ground into a skillet beneath her bare feet. The ash from her burned-out life stuck to her skin, a gray shroud she couldn't wash away. Her stockings were in tatters, stiff with dried blood, offering no protection at all. She was walking on raw nerves and bone. Then the wind changed. For a second, just a second, it brought a different smell. Not smoke, not dust. It smelled of pine trees, of cool water, of high, clean places. It smelled like hope. But her legs were shaking now, a tremor she couldn't control. Her vision started to swim at the edges. She stumbled up one last ridge as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, and she collapsed behind a granite boulder, pulling Levi's tiny body tight against her own. This was it. This was the end of the road. A single hawk circled high above, a black speck against a violet sky. Then another joined it. She closed her eyes, listening, waiting for the sound of wolves. At least it would be a quick end. A quiet one. But the sound that came wasn't a howl. It wasn't the snarl of a predator. It was the soft, rhythmic thud of a horse's hooves. The sound stopped nearby. Then, the whisper of footsteps on dry grass. And then, silence. A heavy, watching silence. Sorella's heart hammered against her ribs. One of them had followed her, a man from the town, come to finish the job. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying Levi wouldn't make a sound. But curiosity was a stubborn thing. Slowly, carefully, she opened one eye, just a slit. A man was standing there, but he wasn't from Redemption. He was Lakota. His leather shirt was open, showing a chest as brown and hard as the earth. 2 dark braids, thick as ropes, rested on his shoulders. He had a bow slung over his back, but there was no arrow notched. He wasn't aiming. He was just watching. His eyes, dark and sharp as pieces of flint, moved from the sleeping child on her chest to her face, then down to the hem of her soot-black skirt. She waited for the look of disgust, for the judgment. For him to turn his back on her, the white woman who was clearly nothing but trouble. Everyone else had. But he didn't do any of those things. Instead, he knelt. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if not to spook a wounded animal. And he placed something on the ground in front of her. It was a blanket, woven with deep reds and blacks. He pushed it toward her. Sorella tried to thank him, to say anything, but her throat was a desert. A dry, rasping sound was all that came out. The man seemed to understand. He reached into a leather pouch at his hip, pulled out a water skin, and set it down next to the blanket. Then, without a single word, he stood up, turned, and walked back to his horse. He swung himself into the saddle and rode away, melting back into the dusk from which he'd come. No questions, no accusations, no threats, just a blanket and some water. Just kindness. She stared at the spot where he had vanished, her mind reeling. The boy was still breathing, a steady, warm puff of air against her neck. It was real. This had happened. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she allowed a dangerous thought to take root. Maybe, just maybe, someone out here could see her, really see her, and not be afraid. She pulled the heavy wool blanket over them, the scent of sage and wood smoke clinging to it. It was the warmest thing she'd felt in days, but she didn't dare to sleep. All she could feel was the fire still burning inside her, the phantom pains in her feet where the skin had been burned and torn away. She had survived the fire in the town, but she was beginning to think there was another fire, a worse one, burning right under her skin, and she had no idea if she could ever put it out. The sun rose, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. The first thing Sorella felt was the pain. It was a deep, grinding ache in her feet, a pain that had settled into her very bones. She had forced herself to stay awake all night, watching the stars, listening to every snap of a twig, convinced the Lakota man was a ghost, a hallucination brought on by heat and grief. She was sure she'd wake up and the blanket would be gone, but it wasn't. The heavy red blanket was still there. In fact, it was folded, neatly, placed right beside her as if someone had returned in the dead of night, checked on her, and left without a sound. Her breath caught in her throat. He had come back, or he had never truly left. A new wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over her. Why? What did he want? People didn't just give things away for free out here. Kindness was a currency, and she had nothing left to pay with. Then she saw it. Sitting on a flat gray stone just a few feet away was a small wooden bowl. Steam was still rising from it in the cool morning air. It was filled with a thick, warm porridge speckled with wild berries. And next to the bowl, was a pair of moccasins. They were made of soft, supple deer skin, tied with rawhide laces. They were small. They were her size. Her hands trembled as she reached for them. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her feet were a mangled mess of blisters and blood. She pressed her fingers into the leather. It was still warm, as if from the heat of the hands that had made them, or the hands that had just left them there. He had been here, minutes ago, watching her sleep, waiting. And still, he made no sound, showed no face. It felt less like a gift and more like a test, or a trap. She didn't trust it. She couldn't. Trust had been burned out of her along with her home, but the gnawing hunger in her belly was a more powerful force than suspicion. She looked at Levi, still sleeping, his small face pale and drawn. She had to be strong for him. She picked up the bowl. She fed Levi first, blowing on each spoonful to cool it, her movements slow and deliberate. The boy ate without a word, his eyes wide and vacant. He hadn't really spoken since the fire. When his small belly was full, he curled up against her and immediately fell back asleep. Only then did Sorella allow herself to eat. She devoured the porridge like a starved wolf, the sweet berries bursting in her mouth. As the warmth spread through her, something tight and cold inside her chest began to loosen, just a fraction. She stood up, wincing, and slid her mutilated feet into the moccasins. They fit. They weren't perfect, but they were a miracle. They were protection. She gathered the precious red blanket, hoisted the sleeping Levi onto her back, securing him with a makeshift sling, and started walking. She didn't know where she was going, but she followed the one clue she had, the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke in the air. He had a camp. He had to. And if he was leaving her gifts, he couldn't be far. She moved toward the sparse line of trees on the horizon. Within 10 minutes, she found it. It was a small, temporary camp. A single hide tent, a ring of blackened stones for a fire, and one lean, muscular horse tied loosely to a juniper branch. And there he was, the Lakota warrior. He was sitting cross-legged by the cold fire pit, carving a small piece of wood with a knife made of bone. He didn't startle when she stepped out of the tall grass. He didn't even flinch. He just lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers for a brief, intense moment. Then he looked back down at his work, as if a half-dead woman and a child appearing in his camp was the most normal thing in the world. Sorella stood there, frozen. What was she supposed to do? What was she supposed to say? Thank you felt too small, too weak for what he had done. It felt like an admission of helplessness, and she'd had enough of that. So she said nothing. Instead, she walked over to the other side of the fire ring and sat down. She didn't ask for permission. She just claimed the space, settling Levi, who was still fast asleep, in her lap. The silence between them was thick and heavy, more like a presence than an absence of sound. She watched his hands as he worked the knife. They were strong, steady hands. He finished his carving and set the small object on a stone between them. It was a bird. A tiny wooden bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. A gift? A message? Or just a way to pass the time? She didn't know. Her hands, without her telling them to, moved to the hem of her skirt. She pulled it down, making sure it covered the new moccasins, hiding the proof of her weakness, of her wounds. It was a gesture of pure instinct, but he noticed. He stopped carving. He didn't say a word, but she saw it in his eyes. A flicker of something. Understanding. Pity. She couldn't tell, but as he looked at her, she had the unnerving feeling that he didn't need to see her feet to know what was hidden underneath. He already knew exactly what she was hiding, and that somehow was the most terrifying thing of all. That night, the warrior built no fire. He simply coaxed the embers from the day before back to a dull, red glow. It was enough to keep the chill of the high prairie at bay, but not enough to cast revealing shadows. Not enough light to expose the secrets she was so desperate to keep hidden. Sorella wrapped Levi in the heavy red blanket and curled her body around his, a fragile shield against the vast, dark world. But she didn't sleep. Her eyes remained fixed on the man who sat just a few yards away. He sat with his legs folded, his spine perfectly straight, as still and silent as the granite boulders dotting the landscape. He was a statue carved from the night itself. She didn't know his name. He hadn't offered it. He hadn't asked for hers. They were two strangers, bound by a shared silence and a deep, unspoken tension. Yet, there was something in the way he would occasionally glance in her direction. It was never a long look, never a prying stare. It was a quick, almost imperceptible check. It told her that he was aware of her. She wasn't invisible to him. She just wasn't his prey. And that was a feeling so foreign it made her skin prickle. Her entire life, she'd been watched. Watched by her stern father, watched by a husband whose eyes promised violence, watched by a town that saw her as a threat. She was used to being hunted. This feeling of being observed but not judged was deeply unsettling. When the first hint of dawn touched the sky, he rose without a sound and vanished into the trees. For a frantic moment, Sorella thought about running. This was her chance. She could grab Levi and flee, head west, find a railroad, a bigger town, some anonymous place where she could disappear, melt into a crowd, and be forgotten. But when she tried to stand, a bolt of white-hot pain shot up from her feet, coursing through her legs. The moccasins were a blessing, a soft leather skin protecting her, but the damage underneath was deep. The wounds were festering, and Levi needed food, he needed water, he needed rest. Running wasn't an option anymore, so she sat back down, defeated, and waited. When the warrior returned, he was carrying a freshly skinned rabbit in one hand and two gourds filled with clean water in the other. He offered no greeting, no explanation. He simply handed them to her, gave a single sharp nod, and then turned his attention to rekindling the fire. As he expertly prepared the meat, she found herself watching his hands. They moved with an economy of motion, a practiced gentleness. He looked like a man who was used to caring for things, a man used to being trusted. She'd never known a man like that. After they had eaten the roasted rabbit in their customary silence, she knew she had to face it. She limped behind the hide tent, seeking a sliver of privacy, and carefully peeled back the moccasins. The sight made her stomach clench. The burns had blistered, and the blisters had broken. The skin was cracked and weeping, and a fresh line of blood traced where she had put too much weight on her left foot. She bit her lip so hard she tasted blood, determined not to make a sound. She tore a strip from her petticoat to try and rewrap them, her hands shaking. When she looked up, he was there, standing just a few feet away, watching. Her skirt was still lifted to her knees, her ruined feet exposed to the morning light. A gasp escaped her lips and she yanked the fabric down, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over her. He didn't say anything. He just took one slow step forward. She shook her head, a silent, desperate plea. Don't. Please don't. But he didn't stop. He knelt before her, moving with the same slow grace as a man approaching a wounded doe, a creature that might bolt at any second. She froze, every muscle in her body tensed, ready for a blow, an insult, a touch that would break her. But his hands didn't reach for her. They reached for the dirty, torn hem of her skirt. And then he spoke. It was the first time she had heard his voice, and it was nothing like she expected. It wasn't harsh or guttural. It was deep, calm, and steady, like the sound of a river flowing over smooth stones. He said two words that changed everything. He said, "These walked." Her throat closed up. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. These walked. He wasn't looking at her feet with pity or with the revulsion she had seen in the eyes of the townsfolk. He was looking at them with something that felt terrifyingly like reverence, as if her scars were not a mark of her ruin, but a map of her survival. As if the journey she had made, broken and bleeding, was something sacred. She should have pulled away. She should have screamed. Any other man would have recoiled in horror. But he didn't. He just looked, his eyes memorizing the geography of her pain, the landscape of ash and torn skin. And then she realized what he was doing. His fingers gently brushed the hem of her skirt, not to lift it higher, but to hold it in place. He wasn't trying to expose her. He was making sure the wind didn't reveal more than she was ready to show. He had a cloth, dipped in water he must have warmed by the fire, and with an impossible tenderness, he began to clean her wounds. She hadn't asked him to. She hadn't said a word. But he moved with a quiet, focused care, as if her feet were made of spun glass and bone china. Her eyes began to sting, but not from the pain of the water on raw flesh. It was the silence. The gentle, accepting silence. No one had touched her with such care in her entire life. Not since she was a small child. Her husband's touch had been about ownership, about leaving bruises. The townspeople's touch had been shoves and stones, and now this man, this complete stranger whose name she didn't even know, was kneeling in the dirt before her, honoring the very things she thought had destroyed her. He was treating her wounds as if they were holy relics. When he was finished, he took strips of cloth from his own tunic, clean and soft, and carefully bandaged her feet. He slipped the deerskin moccasins back on, his movements deft and sure. Then he stood up, gave her that same single nod, and walked back toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there. The moment he was out of sight, Sorella collapsed. She wrapped her arms around herself, burying her face in her knees, and she shook. She hated how much it meant. She hated the hot surge of gratitude that felt like a betrayal of her own self-sufficiency. How could something so simple, an act of basic human decency, feel like it had cracked her ribs open and poured molten sunlight into her chest? That night, she couldn't sleep, but this time, it wasn't because of the pain in her feet. It was because her body, so long braced for harm, didn't know how to exist in a state of rest. It didn't know how to accept kindness without searching for the price tag. She lay awake, watching the pinprick stars, listening to Levi's soft, even breathing beside her. And she wondered, who was this man? Was he a spirit? A ghost? Or was he something far more dangerous? A man who knew how to heal the very wounds that kept her running. In the morning, there was another offering by the fire, a small flute, carved from pale wood, simple and elegant. It was small enough for a child's hands. When Levi woke, his eyes fell on it immediately. He picked it up, his small fingers wrapping around the smooth wood. He put it to his lips and blew, producing a series of discordant squeaks. But then he did something Sorella hadn't seen in weeks. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his tired eyes. And seeing that, for the first time since the fire, Sorella smiled too. Later that morning, the warrior returned. He carried no game this time, just a branch of dark, wild choke cherries and a small leather pouch. He set them down beside her without a word. She looked up at him, her heart a knot of confusion and suspicion. She had to ask. The question clawed its way up her raw throat. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why are you helping me?" He held her gaze, his dark eyes steady. And then he spoke again, his voice that same low, calm river. "Because you kept walking." He didn't offer any more than that. He didn't need to. In that moment, she understood that for him, for his people, the act of walking wasn't just about moving from one place to another. It was an act of will. It was a refusal to surrender. It was a testament of the spirit against the flesh. It meant choosing to live when dying would have been so much easier. She looked down at her feet, hidden inside the soft moccasins. They were ugly. They were ruined. But they had brought her here. For the first time, she didn't feel shame. She felt a flicker of something else, something that might have been pride. But then a cold thought snaked its way into her mind. He said you kept walking. How did he know how long she'd been walking? How did he know what she was running from? He hadn't just found her by chance on that ridge. He had been watching her, following her. But for how long? And why? The kindness suddenly felt like a carefully constructed cage, and she was the bird he was trying to tame. Every gift, every gentle gesture, was another bar in the trap. He wasn't just a savior. He was a hunter, and she was still his prey. They stayed on that ridge for 4 days. 4 days of tense, watchful silence. Sorella never asked to stay, but the warrior, whose name she finally learned was Tama, never pushed her to leave. It felt like a strange, unspoken negotiation. He would provide for her, tend to her wounds, and in return, she would stay put. She was his prisoner, but a willing one. Each morning he would disappear into the dawn mist, a silent phantom, and return hours later with something she didn't even know she needed. Smoked fish wrapped in broad leaves, a thick bison hide to sleep on, a clay pot filled with a bitter, earthy-smelling tea that dulled the constant throbbing ache in her feet. And every single night, he carved. He sat by the embers of the fire, his knife flashing in the dim light, and he would create a tiny wooden animal, a turtle with an intricately cross-hatched shell, a sleeping bear cub, a hawk with its wings outstretched. And each night, he would place the new carving beside Levi's sleeping form, like a silent blessing, a talisman to ward off the bad dreams. Then he would retreat to the edge of the camp, a solitary figure against the endless stars, and sit with the silence as if it were his oldest friend. Sorella spoke little, but she watched everything. She watched the way he moved, the way he listened to the wind, the way his eyes would scan the horizon. He was looking for something, or someone. She was sure of it. On the 5th day, a sliver of her old self returned. She couldn't just sit there anymore, a helpless invalid. She limped down to the small, trickling creek, and kneeling on the muddy bank, she began to scrub their few pieces of clothing against a smooth, flat rock. Her legs trembled with the effort, but her hands were steady. It felt good to do something useful, something normal. Tama saw her from the tree line. She felt his eyes on her, but he didn't approach. He didn't interfere. He just watched. That night, the carving he placed by the fire was different. It was another bird, but this one was larger than the others. Its wings were spread wide, caught in the moment of powerful takeoff. He set it on the stone between them, a clear message. Then he looked at her, his expression unreadable, and said, "Tomorrow, we go." She didn't ask where. A part of her was terrified. But another, deeper part of her felt a strange sense of relief. The waiting was over. Something was about to happen. A fragile tendril of trust had begun to grow in the barren soil of her fear. It wasn't blind trust. It was the trust a winter-beaten tree has in the sun, a trust born from surviving the frost. She just nodded. Later that night, as Levi slept soundly between them, she finally gave him a piece of herself. "My name is Sorella," she whispered into the darkness. He repeated it softly. Sorella. He said it as if it was a name that mattered, a name with weight and history. And then, the dam inside her broke. The words spilled out, a torrent of grief and rage she had held back for so long. She told him about the fire. Not the one that burned her feet, but the slow, simmering fire of a town's hatred. She told him about the Lakota children she had tried to shelter, the whispers that turned to shouts, the stones that shattered her windows, and her peace. "They said I betrayed my kind," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. Tama's eyes, which had been fixed on the glowing embers, narrowed. He turned his head, and in the firelight, she saw a long, thin scar that cut across his left eyebrow. "What kind is that?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. She looked at him then, really looked at him. At the quiet power in his posture, the worn leather of his clothes, the fierce intelligence in his eyes. "The kind that believes kindness is a weakness," she said. He didn't reply. He just reached for the large wooden bird, the one with the powerful wings, and handed it to her. "This one flies," he said. She turned the carving over in her palm. The wood was rough-hewn, imperfect, but the wings were wide and strong. They were made for the sky. She clutched it tightly, a silent promise to herself, and tucked it into the small pouch where she kept Levi's extra pair of moccasins. The path ahead was a terrifying unknown. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was just running away from something. She was walking toward it, even if she didn't know what it was yet. The next morning was shrouded in a thick, wet mist that clung to the trees like ghostly fingers. Sorella secured Levi to her back with the red blanket, the boy a warm, trusting weight against her spine. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward, with Tama walking silently beside her. Every single footfall was an agony. A sharp, searing pain shot from her healing soles all the way up her back, but she refused to cry out. She refused to ask him to stop. She needed him to see that she could do this. She would not be carried. Tama, for his part, didn't offer his horse. He didn't reach out to steady her when she stumbled on a loose rock. He simply walked close. Close enough that if she fell, she wouldn't fall alone. They descended from the ridge, entering a narrow, winding canyon where the rocks were slick with moisture. The world grew quiet, the mist swallowing every sound except for their footsteps and her own ragged breathing. Hours crawled by. The bandages on her right foot began to soak through with fresh blood. She gritted her teeth, the metallic taste filling her mouth again. Finally, Tama paused. He held out the water skin. As she drank, she instinctively lifted her skirt to check the damage. She flinched, not from the sight of the blood, but from the hot wave of shame that came with it. Her weakness, exposed again. He saw it. He saw everything. And just as he had done before, he knelt in the dirt without a word. He gently unwrapped the blood-soaked bandage, his movements economical and sure. He cleaned the wound with water from his own skin, and as he worked, he whispered 2 words, the same 2 words as before. Still walking. That's all it took. 2 words. They sank into her soul like warm sunlight melting ice. She hadn't cried when the townspeople dragged her from her burning home. She hadn't cried when she buried the other Lakota boy, the one she couldn't save. She hadn't even cried when Levi had gone 2 days without food, his little body limp with hunger. But now, kneeling on a muddy trail in the middle of nowhere, with this silent, mysterious man tying a strip of his own sash around her bleeding foot, the tears finally came. They weren't loud, racking sobs. They were silent, hot tears that streamed down her face, washing away the layers of grime and grief. It felt like she could finally breathe again. Tama didn't speak. He didn't try to comfort her. He simply finished his task, stood up, and offered her his hand. It wasn't an offer of support, not a crutch for her to lean on. It was a choice, an invitation. She looked at his calloused, open palm, and then she looked into his eyes, and she took it. His grip was firm, warm, and steady. They walked on, hand in hand, through the mist. By nightfall, the canyon opened up into a wide, sheltered clearing. A slow-moving creek snaked through a grove of cottonwood trees, and there, nestled near the water, was a small settlement. Not a village, but a handful of low, hide-covered lodges. A fire burned cheerfully in the center, and an old woman was stirring a large pot that smelled of stew and herbs. Children were laughing and chasing each other in the shallows of the creek. No one stared when they emerged from the trees. No one ran. There were no shouts of alarm, no looks of suspicion. A young boy, seeing Levi on Sorella's back, ran up to them and offered Levi a small, carved whistle. A teenage girl with kind eyes came forward and draped a warm, woolen shawl around Sorella's trembling shoulders, all without saying a word. It was a welcome. A quiet, unquestioning welcome. Tama finally turned to her, his face softening in the warm firelight. "This is where we stop," he said. She looked around at the peaceful scene, at the faces that held no judgment, only a calm curiosity. It felt like a dream. "For how long?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. He shrugged, a small, simple gesture that seemed to hold a world of meaning. "As long as your feet need." Her breath hitched in her chest. She reached back and touched Levi's head. He was clutching the whistle, his small body finally relaxed against hers. She looked down at her own filthy, blood-stained skirt, at the worn moccasins, at the woman she had become, a creature of fire and ash. She didn't try to hide it this time. And no one asked her to. She had walked through hell. But maybe, just maybe, she had finally walked out the other side. But as she took in the scene, a new, chilling detail emerged. The children playing by the creek, the old woman by the fire, the few men mending a fishing net. They all had something in common. Scars, a burn mark on a man's arm, a long, thin scar on a woman's cheek, just like Tama's. These weren't just people, they were survivors. And suddenly she knew. This wasn't just a village. It was a refuge, and these people weren't just Tama's tribe. They were his family, and they were all hiding from the same thing, the same fire, the same men who had burned her life to the ground. She hadn't just stumbled into a sanctuary. She had stumbled into the heart of a secret war. And Tama hadn't just saved her. He had recruited her. That night, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sorella didn't sleep because she was afraid. She didn't sleep because her mind was a whirlwind, spinning and respinning the story of her life, trying to make the new pieces fit. She lay under a thick buffalo hide in one of the lodges, Levi sleeping peacefully beside her, his hand clutching the little carved whistle. Her feet, cleaned and wrapped in fresh bandages and a soothing balm of sweetgrass and herbs, throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. But it was a different kind of pain now. It wasn't the screaming agony of fresh wounds. It was the ache of healing, the ache of memory. She replayed every moment since she'd fled redemption. The trail of gifts, the food, the moccasins, the water. It wasn't random kindness. It was a calculated strategy. Tama had been tracking her. He had known exactly who she was, where she'd come from. He had been testing her, watching to see if she had the strength, the will, to keep going. He hadn't rescued a victim. He had been searching for a fighter. In the morning, she rose before anyone else and stepped out into the cool, crisp air. The grass was wet with dew. She stood barefoot, testing her weight. It still hurt, but the pain wasn't a punishment anymore. It was a reminder. Tama was already awake, sitting by the creek, sharpening a flint-bladed knife against a whetstone. He looked up as she approached, his eyes as unreadable as ever, but there was no surprise in them. He had been expecting her. "I want to help," she said, her voice clear and steady. There was no tremor of fear, no hint of pleading. It was a statement, an offer. He gave a single, sharp nod. No questions, no long speeches, just acceptance, just trust. He led her over to a rack of bison hides that were being stretched and dried in the sun. An elderly woman, her face a beautiful road map of wrinkles, and her hair the color of spun silver, showed Sorella how to use a curved bone tool to scrape the last bits of flesh from the hide. It was brutal, exhausting work. Her arms screamed in protest, her back ached, but she didn't stop. With every scrape, every rhythmic pull of the tool, she felt something inside her click into place. It wasn't about gratitude anymore. It was about purpose. It was about earning her place, not with words, but with work. Later that afternoon, she sat on a flat, sun-warmed stone, mending a tear in Levi's tunic with a bone needle and sinew thread. She watched her son playing by the creek. Two older boys were patiently showing him how to skip stones across the water's surface. And Levi was laughing, a real, deep belly laugh, a sound she thought she might never hear again. He was safe here. He was happy. The heavy red blanket, the one that had been her shield and her hiding place, lay folded beside her. She didn't need to hide anymore. As the sun began to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the camp, Tama approached. He crouched down beside her, his presence calm and solid. He was holding a new pair of moccasins. These were different from the first pair. They were made of a darker, tougher hide, and the toes were decorated with intricate beadwork, tiny blue and white flowers. He held one out to her. "These are for where you're going," he said. Her hands stilled. She took the moccasin from him, her fingers tracing the delicate beads. It was beautiful. It was a gift of immense value. But his words echoed in her mind. "Where you're going." "Where am I going?" she whispered, her heart beginning to pound. He looked at her then, not at her face, or her hands, or her feet. He looked at all of her, as if he could see the tangled mess of her past and the uncertain lines of her future. "That's for you to choose," he said quietly. "But there's something you need to know first." He paused, his gaze growing heavy. "The children you sheltered," he began, his voice low. "The ones from the fire. They were not just orphans, Sorella. The boy you couldn't save. His name was Little Hawk. He was my brother's son. My nephew." Sorella's blood ran cold. The needle slipped from her fingers. The air seemed to rush out of her lungs. "And Levi," Tama continued, his eyes locking onto hers. His father was our chief. The world tilted on its axis. Levi, her little Levi, the quiet, fragile boy clinging to her back. He wasn't just an orphan she had saved from a fire. He was the son of a chief. He was royalty. He was the future of these people. And then, the most devastating piece fell into place. The preacher in redemption, Thomas said, his voice hardening into granite. He wants this land, all of it. He and his men have been burning our winter camps, driving us from our hunting grounds for 2 seasons. They call us savages to justify their greed. The attack on your cabin, it wasn't about you being a witch, Sorella. You were just in the way. They came for the children. They came to kill the future of our tribe. She hadn't just stumbled upon a feud. She hadn't just performed an act of kindness. She had unknowingly sheltered the 2 most important children of the Lakota resistance from a targeted assassination. She had failed to save one, but she had, by some miracle, escaped with the other. She looked from Tama's grim face to Levi, who was now trying to teach a puppy how to fetch a stick. Her little boy, the chief's son. Tama hadn't just been tracking a survivor, he had been hunting for his lost king. And he had found him, clinging to a broken woman with burned feet on the edge of a ridge. Her eyes filled with tears again, but they were different now. They were tears of a terrible, profound understanding. She wasn't a victim who had been saved. She was a guardian who had, against all odds, succeeded. She set the new moccasins in her lap, looked down at her scarred, ugly, beautiful feet, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. She finally understood what Tama meant. These walked. Her feet hadn't just carried her away from death. They had carried the future of an entire nation to safety. The revelation settled over the small camp like a heavy blanket. Sorella was no longer just the white woman with the burned feet. She was the one who had walked through fire with their future on her back. The way the others looked at her changed. The quiet acceptance was now tinged with a deep, palpable reverence. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She was a part of their story. The days that followed were a blur of activity. What had been a quiet refuge was now a war camp in waiting. The men, led by Tama, began to prepare. They weren't planning to run, they were planning to fight. Sorella found her role. She didn't know how to use a bow, and she couldn't track like the hunters. But she knew the enemy. She knew the preacher. His name was Reverend Gideon Cole. She knew his arrogance, his greed, his belief that God was on the side of the man with the most guns. She sat with Tama and the other warriors for hours, drawing maps of redemption in the dirt with a stick. She told them about the secret paths in and out of the town, about the men who followed Cole not out of faith, but out of fear. She became their strategist. Her knowledge was her weapon. Levi, blissfully unaware of his own importance, began to thrive. He was no longer the silent, haunted child who had arrived in the camp. He ran with the other children, his laughter echoing through the trees. He was learning their language, their songs, their ways. He still called Sorella Mama, but now he was also learning the stories of his father, the great chief who had died fighting Cole's men. Tama carved a wolf for him one night, its head tilted back in a silent howl. "Why a wolf?" Sorella asked, watching Levi turn the small wooden figure over in his hands. "The wolf does not lead from the back," Tama said, not looking at her. "He walks ahead. He finds the path. He protects the pack." He was talking about Levi, but he was also talking about her. One evening, as the camp prepared for the inevitable confrontation, the old woman with the silver braids, the one they called grandmother, brought Sorella to the central fire. In a solemn ceremony, she painted a thin, vertical line of white ash down the center of Sorella's forehead. Then, she guided her to a basin of warm water, fragrant with cedar and crushed berries, and gently placed her scarred feet into it. Sorella tensed, the old shame trying to rear its head. But then Tama knelt before her, just as he had on the ridge, and placed his hands on either side of the basin. He didn't touch her, he just held the space. "This is not to heal," the grandmother said, her voice surprisingly strong. "The body knows its own healing. This is to honor." Sorella looked around the circle of fire-lit faces. No one looked at her with pity. They looked at her with respect. Levi, holding his wooden wolf, came and stood by her knee, a small, fierce protector. Tama's voice came next, low and steady. "Some fires are meant to destroy," he said, his eyes meeting hers across the water. "And some fires are meant to choose." Her lip trembled. The truth of his words settled into her bones. The fire in redemption hadn't just destroyed her home. It had burned away everything she thought she was, a helpless woman, a victim, an outcast. It had stripped her down to the barest, strongest version of herself. It had forged her into the person she was now. When the grandmother lifted her feet from the water and dried them with a soft cloth, Sorella stood without a trace of shame. The white ash on her forehead felt like a crown. Her feet were red and puckered and permanently scarred, and they were whole. A few days later, a scout returned with grim news. Cole and a dozen of his men were on their way. They weren't raiding this time. They were hunting. Someone had talked. Someone had betrayed them. Fear, cold and familiar, rippled through the camp. But it wasn't the paralyzing fear of a victim. It was the sharp, focused fear of a warrior before a battle. They knew this day would come. Tama gathered the warriors. Their plan had been to fortify the camp, to make a stand. But now, with a traitor in their midst, that was a death sentence. They were outmanned, outgunned. "We cannot fight them here," one of the men said, his voice tight with anger. "They will surround us and burn us out like rats." "Then we run," another said. "We take the children and flee north." Panic began to simmer. This was it, the end. But then Sorella spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the rising tide of fear like a knife. "No," she said. "You don't run, and you don't fight them here. You fight them there." All eyes turned to her. She walked to the map she had drawn in the dirt. She pointed with a stick to a narrow pass in the canyon, the same one she and Tama had walked through. "He's arrogant," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Cole thinks you're savages. He thinks you'll run and hide, or that you'll fight with brute force. He won't be expecting a trap. He won't be expecting you to think like him." She looked at Tama. "He'll ride straight through this canyon. He'll think you're on the run, that he has you cornered." Tama's eyes narrowed, a flicker of understanding in their dark depths. He saw her plan. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It was perfect. It was a strategy born not of Lakota warfare, but of a deep, intimate knowledge of a white man's pride. The camp moved with a silent, deadly efficiency. The women, children, and elders were sent away with a small guard, heading for a secret meeting place deep in the mountains. Only a handful of warriors remained with Tama and Sorella. She refused to leave. "I started this," she said to Tama, her jaw set. "I will see it finished." He didn't argue. He just handed her a knife. The traitor was a young warrior named Raven's Wing. His family had been killed in one of Cole's earlier raids, and Cole had promised him riches and safety in exchange for the location of the camp. He believed Cole's lies. Sorella had seen his kind before in redemption. Men willing to sell their souls for a piece of a world that would never truly accept them. They didn't punish him. They used him. Tama told Raven's Wing that they were fleeing north, just as he expected. He sent the young warrior ahead, ostensibly to scout the path, knowing he would ride straight to Cole and report their cowardice. The trap was set. The warriors, their faces painted with streaks of black and gray, melted into the rocks high above the canyon pass. They were like ghosts, invisible against the stone. Sorella and Tama waited at the mouth of the canyon, hidden behind a cluster of boulders. Levi was safe. He was with the grandmother. All that was left was the waiting. Hours later, they heard them, The clatter of hooves, the jingle of harnesses, the rough laughter of confident men. Reverend Gideon Cole rode at the front, his face flushed with triumph. He was a big man, with a thick beard and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. Raven's Wing rode beside him, pointing ahead into the canyon. "They're in there!" he shouted over the wind. "Trapped! Just like I told you!" Cole laughed, a booming, ugly sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "The Lord has delivered the heathen into our hands," he roared. "Let's go finish God's work." They rode into the narrow pass, a dozen men, rifles held ready, their arrogance making them blind. They were halfway through when Tama gave the signal. A high, piercing whistle like that of a hawk. From above, a volley of arrows rained down, not at the men, but at their horses. Screams of terror, both human and animal, filled the air as the wounded horses bucked and fell, throwing their riders to the ground. Confusion turned to panic. The narrow canyon walls offered no escape. Then the warriors descended. They moved like shadows, silent and swift, knives flashing in the dim light. It wasn't a battle, it was a reckoning. But Cole was a survivor. He scrambled from under his fallen horse, a pistol in his hand. He saw Tama, the clear leader, and he aimed. But before he could fire, a figure stepped out from behind the boulders. It was Sorella. Her hair was wild, the white ash on her forehead a stark slash against her skin. She held her own knife, her knuckles white. Cole's eyes widened in disbelief. "The witch," he breathed. "I thought you burned." "You tried," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "But the fire chose me." He laughed, a crazed, desperate sound. He turned the pistol toward her. "Then I'll send you back to your master in hell." But as he aimed, a small figure darted out from behind Sorella. It was Levi. He wasn't supposed to be there. He must have snuck away from the others. He held his little wooden wolf in his hand, and his face was a mask of pure, childish fury. He threw the wolf with all his might. The small piece of wood struck Cole's gun hand. It was just enough. The shot went wide, ricocheting off the canyon wall. And in that split second of distraction, Tama was on him. The fight was short and brutal. In the end, Reverend Gideon Cole lay still in the dust of the canyon he had tried to steal. The remaining townsmen, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons and surrendered. It was over. Later, as the survivors tended to their wounds and secured their prisoners, Sorella sank to her knees, pulling a shaking Levi into her arms. Tama knelt beside her. He picked up the small wooden wolf from the dust and handed it back to Levi. Then he looked at Sorella, and for the first time, he smiled. A true, warm smile that reached his eyes. "You did not walk," he said. "You led." In the weeks that followed, a new kind of peace settled over the valley. The captured men from Redemption were sent back with a message. The land was not for sale, and its people were not afraid. Without Cole's fanaticism to fuel them, the town's aggression faded into wary respect. The Lakota began to rebuild, not in hiding, but in the open. Sorella stayed. She had found her home, not in a place, but with a people. She taught the children to read and write, her quiet strength a constant, steady presence in the camp. One evening, as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, she was dancing. Not for a ceremony, not for anyone else, just for herself. She was barefoot in the soft grass, the hem of her skirt lifted in her hands, not to hide, but to feel the cool earth on her scarred skin. She spun and moved, her body light, her feet no longer a source of pain, but a source of power. They were a testament to her journey. Tama watched her from a distance, his arms folded, a quiet pride in his eyes. When she finished, breathless and laughing, he approached her. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. She took it, their fingers intertwined, a perfect fit. They stood there for a long moment, watching as Levi slept soundly in their lodge, the carved wolf resting on his chest. You made your own path, he said softly. She looked down at her feet, then up at his face, illuminated by the rising moon. Yes, she whispered, but I didn't walk it alone. She looked at her feet, bare in the cool dew. She saw the scars, the discolored skin, the imperfections that told her story. And for the first time in her life, she believed they were beautiful, not because they were healed, but because they had carried her home. If you were captivated by Sorella's journey from the ashes, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss another story from the edge of the wild. Every life has its own fire. What would we find if we looked at the scars you carry? Let us know in the comments below.